Good morning. Welcome to the broadcast. I'm glad you could make it this morning, and it's a pleasure to be here with you and share the reading of the book, The Ark and the Dove, by J. Moss Ives. And if you were listening to Greg Szymanski's investigative journal, the program that just preceded, he interviewed John Daniel, and John Daniel made many references to this book. This book is going to help us understand the Jesuit and the Vatican role, the Catholic role, in the foundation of our country and our government. How is it that the United States becomes the servant of Rome? We've been studying the book Rulers of Evil. We've been studying Revelation chapter 13, Revelation chapter 17, the books of Daniel, and we've come to the inarguable conclusion that the United States plays a prophetic role in the world, and that is to bring the rest of the world to the feet of the Pope. The second beast of Revelation chapter 13 causes the whole world to worship the first beast, Rome. That makes the United States the second beast. And it's a horrendous contemplation, but nonetheless true. And we're seeing this this Pax Americana taking over the world, and is about to resemble that first beast. Excuse me while I get this frog out of my throat. My apologies. A little bit of laryngitis, too much time on the air, both Inquisition Update and amateur radio at night, so I'm try to conserve my voice as much as possible, and my apologies if I'm not too loud this morning. I'll increase my mic a little bit. Now, yesterday when we concluded the reading, we were talking about the suppression of Catholicism in Great Britain, and we were talking about the two Jesuit priests, Person and Campion, who came to the country to minister to the suppressed Roman Catholics in Great Britain. And it was discovered that they were coming, and there was much consternation about it, and so British Parliament acted. And I'll back up a paragraph from where we left off yesterday and bring us up to date. It says, as the persecution became more severe, more priests came to England to brave death in the perilous mission field. In their panic, the Protestants magnified the little group of missionaries into a host of disguised Jesuits. So they're implying here that the Protestants, in their fear and loathing of the Jesuit order, because of all the previous intrigues that the Vatican used, that the papacy used the Jesuits for to try to destroy Parliament government and assassinate Protestant kings and queens. The rumor of these two Jesuits coming to the country and other Roman Catholic priests coming to the country set the Protestants to speculating about what was really going on. And of course, this Roman Catholic writer says that they exaggerated the claims, and basically is what he's saying. He said, the invasion of this imaginary host was met by the seizure of as many priests as the government could lay hands on, and the imprisonment of hundreds of lay Catholics throughout the country. Clearly, the implication is that Great Britain overreacted and conducted itself unfairly. Anyway, it says, this was followed by the calling of an assembly of Parliament early in 1581. The Parliament solemnly enacted that, quote, all persons pretending to any power of absolving subjects, that is, British subjects, from their allegiance, or that is, to the British Crown, their allegiance to the British Crown, or practicing to withdraw them to the Roman religion, that is, to proselytize for the Roman Catholic religion, with all persons after the present session willingly so absolved and reconciled to the see of Rome shall be guilty of high treason. So now here we have high treason linked to any person pretending to absolve British subjects of their allegiance to the British Crown or proselytizing for the Roman Catholic religion. They would be guilty of high treason. Now, this is a powerful proclamation by Parliament, and it's going to have grave consequences for Catholics in Great Britain. And it says, continuing now where we left off yesterday, it says, hiding by day and going forth only by night and under disguise, seldom spending more than one night under the same roof, the mission priests were tracked and hounded by the agents and spies of Cecil. This is the power behind the British throne, this Cecil. He was dedicated to making sure that Roman Catholicism never came back to power in Great Britain, and that the papacy would take back over all the lands and properties that it previously had control of before the Protestant revolt in Great Britain. So Cecil's got a big job to do here. And here's a quote. It says, "We shall not long be able to escape the hands of the heretics," wrote Campion from one of his hiding places. "So many eyes are centered on us, so many enemies beset us. I am constantly disguised and am constantly changing both my dress and my name," unquote. So hot was the pursuit that Parsons was forced to flee to the continent, in other words, flee from Great Britain and go back to mainland Europe. So hot was the pursuit that Parsons was forced to flee to the continent, while Campion was apprehended within a year from the time he crossed the Dover Channel. Parsons never returned to England, and he would probably have suffered the same fate as Campion. Father Campion suffered a cruel martyrdom. England had borrowed her methods of torture from the Spanish Inquisition after these had long been abandoned, and put them into service in the torture of Catholic priests. After his arrest, Campion was racked and tortured with the utmost barbarity. Brought before the Queen to speak in his own defense, it was seen that when he was making a gesture in his speech, all the fingernails had been torn by force from the flesh. A vain attempt was made to have him implicate others in a plot concocted in the futile imagination of Cecil. So Cecil's busy demonizing Campion and suggesting a more widespread plot to overthrow the British crown. And it says, he was finally brought to trial with no less than 12 secular priests and one layman. To their astonishment, they were indicted for a conspiracy to murder the Queen and overthrow the government. There was no evidence to support such a charge. The trial was a travesty. Hallam acknowledged that, quote, it was as unfairly conducted and supported by a slender evidence as can be found in our books, unquote. One was remanded. The others, including Campion, were found guilty and condemned to suffer the death of traitors. This was the sentence pronounced, quote, you must go to the place from whence you came, there to remain until you shall be drawn through the open city of London upon hurdles to the place of execution, and there to be hanged and let down alive, and your privy parts cut off, and your entrails taken out and burned in your sight. Then your hands to be cut off, and your bodies to be divided into 4 parts, to be disposed of at her majesty's pleasure. And God have mercy upon your souls. That's the decree. That's the pronouncement for Campion and those who were found guilty as traitors with him. Upon hearing the sentence, Campion burst out into triumphant hymn, Te Deum Laudamus, Te Deum Confitemer, that is, in which the others joined. he was carried back to the tower and put in irons. His keepers said he had a saint to guard. Friday, December 1st, was fixed for the execution. The day was dismal and raining. Campion and two secular priests, Sherwin and Bryant, were led out and tied to the hurdles. Through the mud and slush they were dragged, with the rabble of ministers and fanatics beside them. The three priests, with faces lit with the internal joy that filled their hearts, actually laughed as they neared Tyburn, and many of the onlookers wondered how this could be. It is said that several converts to the Roman Catholic faith were made that day. The executions were unnecessarily cruel. Before his death, Campion forgave his persecutors and prayed for the queen, whom he acknowledged to be his sovereign. Quote, "We are come here to die, but we are not traitors," unquote, he said upon the scaffold. Quoting further, it says, "I am a Catholic man and a priest. In that faith I have lived and mean to die. If you consider my religion treason, then I am guilty. Other treason I never committed, as God is my judge," unquote. The heroism of the martyred priest won the respect of many Protestants, and when they saw one of the hated Jesuits go to his death with a prayer for the excommunicated Queen Elizabeth on their lips, they questioned whether a system that could send to death such a man as this could prevail. Some there were who gave warnings that too many martyrs were being made for the Church of Rome. Henry Walpole came as a Protestant to witness the death of Campion. He went away inwardly convinced of the truth of the martyr's faith. He afterwards became a Catholic and a Jesuit and suffered a similar fate to Campion. Cecil afterwards issued 2 pamphlets to explain and justify the severities of the tortures that were used in the cases of Campion and the other priests who suffered with him, but his excuses were so weak that Hallam says that they only served to, quote, "mingle contempt with detestation," unquote. The protest that came as a result of these executions did not stay the hand of Cecil. The persecution went on, and, quote, "the rack seldom stood idle in the tower for all the latter part of Elizabeth's reign," unquote. No Catholic could longer enjoy liberty of worship. There was risk of torture and death for the priests, and imprisonment and confiscation of property for the laymen. Pursuivants and recusants now became familiar terms in the English history. To the pursuivants, officers of the humblest rank in the College of Heraldry, but with powers and emoluments by no means humble, was given the privilege of tracking down the Catholic nonconformists, and for reward they received 1/3 part of the property confiscated. Now, it looks like Protestant Great Britain is using the same form and fashion that the papal legates used in hunting down heretics during the Holy Roman Inquisition. That the inquisitors were given 1/3 of the booty if they could find a heretic and bring him to trial and execute him. They were entitled to 1/3 of the booty, and it appears that Protestant Great Britain, for lack of a better term, is just showing Rome their own example. And it says, now this is not I don't condone this, but this is history, and it's important for us to understand that this barbarity that's being imposed upon Roman Catholics is a virtual mirror image of that was perpetrated against Protestants, Bible believers, the Waldenses, the Albigenses, the Huguenots, and all throughout the Crusades and the Inquisitions, and after the Council of Trent, after the Protestant Reformation. These are the cruelties that Catholicism launched against those people, thinking they were doing God's service by eradicating heretics from off the planet. And it says, in this way there was raised a zealous army of heresy hunters, these pursuivants, were heresy hunters, in other words, Catholic hunters. And to each was given, quote, a sense of importance in being an assistant district attorney of God to prepare indictments for the Last Judgment, together with the excitement of playing the amateur detective in uncovering mysterious evildoers, unquote. So now the persecution is gaining organization and strength. These pursuivants were numerous throughout Britain, and it became almost a contest to see who could be the most successful at running down Catholics. And with this great financial incentive, a third of the booty, inspired false accusations of treason. Now it continues. Spying came to be considered an honorable means of livelihood, and the sport of tale-bearing became more popular than ever, now that it was placed on a paying basis. The Catholic victims of the heresy hunters became known as recusants, and their refusal to conform to the national religion, that is, the Anglican Church, the so-called Protestant Church, made a rich living for the army of pursuivants. Their homes were subject to search and their property to seizure at any hour of the day or night. Names of recusants in each parish, amounting to 50,000, had been returned to the Privy Council, and the jails were filled with persons suspected of being priests and harborers of priests. Now let me tell you, history is about to repeat itself in this country, only it is going to be the reverse fashion of what took place in Great Britain. Catholicism is going to have control of the government, and there will be pursuivants, Roman Catholic pursuivants, searching out Bible believers. And we will be the recusants. And the persecution is going to return. That same persecution that marked the dark days of the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages when the papacy ruled supreme, is now going to be felt in what was once Protestant United States of America. And it's important for us to understand history so that we can accurately be able to predict the future. And we know that our predictions are right when they coincide with Scripture. And Scripture clearly describes the United States as that second beast that came out of the wilderness that causes the whole world to worship the first beast which rose up out of the sea of mass humanity in Europe. That was the papacy. That's how God describes the United States and the papacy and what is about to take place. It is taking place now. The United States is causing a global government under the headship of the Pope is going to cause the whole world to worship the papacy. And open religious persecution is going to take place. And it's God's people who are going to suffer until Christ puts a stop to it. Now, next to enter upon the scene of the Elizabethan drama was the Provocateur, a sinister creation of Walsingham, Cecil's chief ally and organizer of the spy system. There had to be Catholic plots with which to frighten the Queen and win her over to the Sicilian policy, Cecil's policies. As there were no real plots, some had to be manufactured. The provocateurs were fewer in number than the pursuivants, but their rewards were greater as a result of their work was more momentous. There were more than these creatures than has been revealed, for they moved stealthily behind the scenes of history, and the names of only a few ever came to light. When a plot was needed, a provocateur was ready at hand to instigate one, and once instigated, it was carefully nurtured until the time came for the great exposé. When Campion came to England on his perilous mission The luckless Mary, Queen of Scots, was held a prisoner in the land where she had sought refuge. Mary, Queen of Scots, she was a Roman Catholic Queen of Scotland, and she was held prisoner in Great Britain, where she originally sought refuge. And it says she threw herself on the mercy of Protestant Elizabeth, only to become a victim of the wiles of Cecil. Elizabeth's promised help for the exiled Scottish queen was not forthcoming. Cecil stood in the way. It did not fit in with his policy to permit a possible Catholic successor to the English throne to be at large. Mary had become the rallying point for the hopes and ambitions of the English Catholics, who had good reason, if they saw fit, to attempt her liberation. In other words, free her from prison. For there was nothing to justify her imprisonment, according to this author. There had been a Catholic uprising in the North Country, which was poorly organized and quickly, ruthlessly put down. In order to convince Elizabeth that her life was in danger as long as the Scottish Queen was living, there was a plot needed which would have for its double purpose the liberation of Mary and the assassination of Elizabeth. No such plot as this had been forthcoming, but Walsingham, the fabricator of plots, was equal to the occasion. The necessary provocateur was found in the person of one Gilbert Gifford, whose perfidy, aided by the cunning of Walsingham and directed by the finesse of Cecil, was soon to bring the Scottish Queen to the block and rid England of a Catholic heir apparent to the throne of the Tudors. There was a strong spiritual bond between the missionaries and the lay Catholics, which had been riveted by the common dangers and perils. It is safe to say that it was the work of the missionary priests that saved the Catholic faith from being utterly exterminated in England. Their most difficult task was to strengthen the faith of those who were easily frightened into conformity to the new religion, that is, Protestantism. The attacks upon the Catholic Church and its priests were making headway with the weaker members of the flock. It was a case of the survival of the most devout. Those who did survive were those whose faith was real and whose spiritual lives had only been deepened by the experiences and sufferings they had undergone. These numbered many of the best families of the nobility, and for them to remain true to their faith meant far more than to others who had less to lose. The loyalty of the English Catholics met a severe test when Philip of Spain sent his Armada to drive Elizabeth from the throne. Now remember, the Pope instigated that, organized the Spanish Armada to invade Great Britain, to overthrow Queen Elizabeth and give England back to the papacy and reestablish Roman Catholicism as the religion of the country. And so we're at the time of the Spanish Armada, and we'll talk more about it when we get back from the break.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening. Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
Welcome back after the break. We're continuing the book, The Ark and the Dove. We're talking about the persecution of of Catholic priests and laymen, and we were talking about the Spanish Armada as well. And it says, the loyalty of the English Catholics met a severe test when Philip of Spain sent his Spanish Armada, to drive Protestant Elizabeth from the throne. The militant faction of Catholics was mostly on the continent, receiving many recruits from the ranks of the English refugees, and there can be no doubt but that this faction planned and hoped for a Catholic uprising in England to aid the Spanish forces in placing a Catholic on the British throne. So here's another attempt by the Pope using another Roman Catholic country, Spain, under King Philip, to gather up an armada to invade England and to overthrow Elizabeth and to put a Catholic monarchy back in control in Great Britain. And this is the state of affairs during this time. Back and forth, warring, Protestants against Catholics, Catholics against Protestants. And he says, finding out where I left off here, there can be no doubt that this faction planned. This faction were the Roman Catholics who were displaced, who fled England and went back to the mainland. They organized to cooperate with the Spanish Armada. So we're looking at a Herculean effort shaping up to reclaim Great Britain for the Pope. And it says, Cardinal Allen was leader of this faction and attempted to enlist support for the Spanish invasion of his native country, Great Britain. Persons forced exile on the continent, and the Spanish influence to which he was subjected unfortunately led him to take the side of Allen. He was betrayed by the hope of regaining England through the intervention of Spain, rather than through the toil and sacrifice of the missionaries. Not all the exiles, however, favored the armed intervention of Spain. Many of these viewed with disapproval, quote, the sight of ministers of a kingdom not of this world dabbling in politics to the certain disgrace of their cause, unquote. Let me read that again and read that in context to what is taking place in Washington, D.C. by all the Roman Catholics in high office. It says, the sight of ministers of a kingdom not of this world dabbling in politics to the certain disgrace of their cause. Yes, so much of Christianity today is engaged in politics, thinking that that is going to be some help in establishing this kingdom of Christ, but I'm sorry. He says, Flanders was the great place of refuge for English exiles who were, quote, not by any means all favorable to the Spanish policy of aggrandizement under the plea of religion, unquote. Only a few, if any, of the Catholics of England gave encouragement to the invaders. There was a Catholic uprising when the Armada neared the English coast, but it was an uprising in support of the Protestant Queen, according to this author. In other words, the lay Catholics of Great Britain, as persecuted as they were, rose in support of Protestant Queen Elizabeth. And it says, all religious differences were forgotten, and all Englishmen, Protestant and Catholic alike, rallied to the standard of their queen. The persecuted and even the imprisoned Catholics laid aside all resentment for their past treatment and offered their services to the government, but it was the queen and not her ministers to whom they pledged their support. Speaking of Cecil here. And it says, the Catholic prisoners in Ely signed a declaration of their readiness to fight in defense of their sovereign against all her enemies, were they kings or priests or pope or any other potentate whatsoever. The ministers themselves, in a report published later, stated that, quote, no difference could be found on this occasion between Protestants and Catholics, unquote, and mentions the Catholic Viscount Montague, who with his son and grandson presented himself before the Queen, quote, at the head of 200 horse that he had raised for the defense of her person, unquote. Quoting further, it says, the Catholic gentry who had been painted as longing for the coming of the stranger, says Green, led their tenantry to the muster at Tilbury. The loyalty of the Catholics decided the fate of Philip's scheme, unquote. The Catholic lords on Allen's list of those for whom help for the invading forces might be expected. Cumberland, Oxford, and Northumberland brought their vessels alongside the English naval fleet as soon as the Armada appeared in the Channel. After the defeat of the Armada, the Catholics received no reward for their loyalty through any cessation of their persecution. There was no recognition in any way of the part they had played in defense of their queen and their country, and no gratitude shown. The persecution was continued with renewed severity, and from the defeat of the Armada to the death of Elizabeth 14 years later, no less than 61 priests, 47 laymen, and 2 women suffered capital punishment for their religion. On one fateful day in August of 1588, no less than 13 men, 6 priests, and 7 laymen suffered death on the scaffold. The persecution spared neither age nor sex. Religious fanaticism was at its height, writes Professor Meyer, and it developed traits hitherto foreign to the character of the English people. In the ferocity with which they treated women and children, Englishmen acted contrary to their true character even more than by resorting to unscrupulous espionage, unquote. It was not uncommon for women and children to be arrested while hearing Mass and cast into prison. A Catholic boy was racked and tortured to make him betray his friends and died a traitor's death. According to Willisbond State Trials, he was only 13 years of age. The excommunication continued to be featured with unspeakable cruelty. In addition to this, the penalties of recussancy, heavy fines, frequent search and seizure, and imprisonment visited nearly all who remained true to their faith. There was more need than ever for the ministrations and sacrifices of the mission priests. There were always recruits ready to fill vacancies in the ranks because of the deaths of the martyrs. These came from the young men who had left their homes in England to receive their training and education in the colleges in France and Belgium, and then to return to brave the perils of the mission field. The dawn of the new century found the missionaries gaining in numbers and influence, and all this was to be needed, for the end of the Tudor dynasty was not to mark the end of the persecution. That's the end of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 is entitled Between Two Fires. Again, the book from which we are reading is entitled The Ark and the Dove, a Roman Catholic book. It's going to help us understand the dynamics of religious persecution in Great Britain, to help us explain what has happened in the United States during our time. And it says, James VI, King of Scotland, only offspring of the unfortunate marriage of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Lord Darnley, paid a price for the English throne, and so became James I of England. The price paid was his tacit consent to his mother's execution. In addition to receiving the promise of his succession to Elizabeth, he received, to boot, a liberal pension and 6 pairs of bloodhounds. When his mother's life was in peril and she needed the support of her son, he abandoned her to her fate. Soon after her sentence, he sent envoys, one of whom was a pensioner of the English court, to request that proceedings against his mother be stayed until he could be made acquainted with her offense. It was suggested that Mary's life be spared on condition that she resign her rights to her son. This would secure Elizabeth from the fear of a competitor, and the established church, that is, the Protestant church, from danger of a Catholic successor. When it was replied that Mary had no rights to resign, the envoys represented that their master would be compelled in honor to avenge his mother's death. One of the envoys assured Elizabeth, however, that James had sent them merely to save appearances, and that whatever he might pretend, he would be easily pacified with a, quote, present of dogs and deer, unquote. On the receipt of the news of his mother's execution, he wept and talked of vengeance. But when members of the Scottish Parliament, on their bended knees, implored him to avenge his mother's death, he put them off by saying he must consult his allies. His resentment, such as it was, soon evaporated. It was believed at the time that he looked upon the death of his mother as a personal benefit, for it relieved him from his fear of a rival for the Scottish throne. In justice to Mary Stuart, it can be said that her son inherited more from his father than from his mother. He inherited nearly all of Darnley's weak traits, including a trait of cowardice. He had read and studied much, but had learned little. Of what little he had learned, he made a great show. He claimed with some excuse to be a great theologian, but religion to him, as to most of those who were to help him rule his new kingdom, was a matter of politics. When he came to England, James had 3 choices of outward religious faith: Anglican, Catholic, and Puritan. Presbyterianism offered him no choice. He knew that if he espoused the cause of the state church, he would be its head. This appealed to his pride and vanity, and of these traits there was far more in his character than any real religion. There were reasons why he should be inclined toward a policy of toleration. It was for his interest to effect a compromise among the opposing factions. He had shown favor to Catholics and had promised to relieve the severity of their fines. The Pope looked favorably upon him and ordered the missionary priest to countenance no action against him. There were 2 factors, however, that militated against a charge of religious policy and shattered the early hopes of the Catholics for a lessening of their persecution. While there had been a change of dynasties in the English monarchy from the House of Tudor to the House of Stuart, there was no change in the power behind the throne. When Walsingham died in 1590, the first Cecil, Lord Burnley, had his son Robert become his assistant. Upon the death of the father, the young Cecil took control of the invisible government, and true to his father's policy, he saw to it that England remained anti-Catholic. It was Robert Cecil who placed James on the throne, as his father before him had given the throne to Elizabeth. Without the new king being quite aware of what it was all about, his prime minister became master of the government, and the first Stuart king yielded unconsciously to the dictatorship of the House of Cecil, and had the last of the Tudor monarchs. Robert Cecil was aware of the danger to his power and fortune that would come if James was allowed to grant toleration to Catholics. Then there was the slowly rising tide of Puritanism, which was as inimical to Catholicism as was to the government under the sway of Cecil. The Catholics soon found themselves between two fires, and stern repressive policy of the government, prompted by political and mercenary motives, and the enmity of the Puritan party motivated by religious bigotry and prejudice. It is difficult now to see which was the worst for them. Although James was at first inclined to be tolerant toward his Catholic subjects, it was not long before he was accused of being part of papists, being at the heart a papist, and this was a little more than he could stand. In order to remove the impression that he had any leaning toward the Catholic faith, he issued in the second year of his reign a proclamation enjoining the banishment of all Catholic missionaries, and the magistrates were ordered to put the penal laws of the Elizabethan reign into effect. As a result, between 5,000 and 6,000 Catholics had to surrender 2/3 of their estates and incur enormous fines. Many forfeited their entire personal property. In the Star Chamber, James avowed his detestation of the Church of Rome and declared he wanted no child of his to succeed him on the throne if that child should become a Catholic. He did not put to death as many Catholics as did his predecessor, but he made the lot of the living so miserable that they might just as well have suffered martyrdom by death. Then in 1605 came the Gunpowder Plot, and this did not help matters any. For the incredible folly of a few hundred fanatics, the great body of the loyal Catholic subjects who had never countenanced resort to force or violence had to suffer. The plot was so clumsily executed that it was soon discovered. Then there followed what might have been expected. Cecil's power became supreme. England as a nation became definitely Protestant, and Catholics were placed under a ban of suspicion which lasted for over a century. So now, England is, for all intents and purposes, at least at this time, forever Protestant. After the Gunpowder Plot, that was the straw that broke the camel's back for Great Britain. And they came down hard on Catholics. And this is the time when I believe the papacy decided to throw all its weight upon Plan B. And Plan B is the United States of America. But we'll keep reading and learning here. It says in 1606, new and more severe penal laws were enacted. Under the provision of an act for the better repressing of popish recusants, a fine of £20 each month was imposed on all over the age of 16 who refused to attend the services of the Church of England, or in lieu of a fine, to suffer forfeiture of 2/3 of their lands. Now here we have economic sanction for those who refuse to go to the Protestant Church of England, who refuse to attend services at the Protestant Church of England. And I suggest the same thing is going to happen in this country in reverse. Economic sanctions will be imposed on all non-Catholics. Bible believers who will never go to a Roman Catholic church and take the Mass. The shoe's going to be on the other foot in this country. And we're reading this so that we can understand and forecast what is intended to happen in this country once Catholicism becomes supremely powerful and in complete control of our government. Rome is going to do what she has always done. And she's simply going to use what happened in Great Britain as just an excuse. It says, power was given to the king to refuse the fine and seize the land at will. The fine of 20 pounds a month was exacted only of those who were possessed of large estates. At the accession of James, there were not more than 16 Catholics whose landed estates were large enough to allow them to escape forfeiture of their lands by paying fines. Upon the less wealthy fell the hardest exactions of all, the forfeiture of 2/3 of their lands. Those without landed estates were mulcted of their personal property. What did it say in Pope Benedict's encyclical? Something about personal property? No more personal property rights. That's what he said in his encyclical, Caritas in Veritate. And it says, when the fine of 20 pounds a month was exacted for nonconformity, it was made to cover a period of a year, a demand which reduced many families to absolute beggary. The pursuivants, remember these are the ones who were pursuing Roman Catholics, an army of pursuivants in Britain, were not forgotten. A supplementary bill was passed provided that anyone discovering Mass being said or relief being given to a Jesuit missionary priest should receive a reward of 1/3 of any fine imposed or 1/3 of the property forfeited. Again, the heresy hunters stalked through the land. Catholic subjects were at the mercy of these paid spies. They knew not whom to trust among their friends and neighbors, for friendship was often used as a cloak to hide the work of the informer seeking his reward. And like I've said on this broadcast, when this comes down, you won't even be able to trust your own mother. When the Inquisition comes and says, Mother so-and-so, we understand your son is a heretic, and we're pursuing him for prosecution of domestic terrorism or treason and failure to come to Mass on Sunday, and if you don't cough him up, you're going to suffer his fate. You won't be able to trust your own mother. Added to the army of pursuivants were the king's indigent favorites. It was a chance for them to obtain money and property, which they very much needed. Catholics were farmed out to these needy courtiers, who were allowed to make such terms of the recusants as they might please. Many of these courtiers soon favored were men who had come from with the king from Scotland. There had been intense jealousy between the two kingdoms, and these Scot favorites were looked upon as foreigners. For the king to place English subjects at the mercy of these Scottish minions was only to add insult to injury. King James did not hesitate to enrich his own purse at the expense of his Catholic subjects, and before he allowed his favorites to receive plunder, he saw to it that he had some of them for himself. By his own account, he received a net income of £36,000 per annum from fines and forfeitures imposed on Catholics. We'll continue with the reading to probably Friday. Our guest tomorrow again is Nicholas Arthur from Cross the Border. Stay tuned for Nicholas's program, Cross the Border, right after this. Thanks for coming. We'll see you.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn, the Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.